Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for coming here instead of going for your Sunday morning shopping. I was tempted to go to my regular Sunday morning sleeping, but then somebody picked me up at the hotel to come over here to remind me that the occasion is very early in the morning from my usual sort of habits. But then again, also thank you to the faculty and especially to the Dean of the Faculty of Philosophy, also Rahmat Hidayat for inviting me, also Pa Agus Wahyudi for chairing the session. It's great to see my old friend Bob here. I think we see each other once every decade or something like that, which makes me rather old by now, I think. So it's nice that we've still been able to gather here in spite of all the temptations of that are being offered by a nice Sunday morning in Yogyakarta. Now, I've been asked to talk about populism. Well, the first thing to note is that, as Bob was talking about yesterday, or alluded to yesterday in his speech, there has been a rise of populist politics all over the world. And that rise has occurred in very diverse parts of the world. So it's not just the developing countries, it's not just the advanced countries, it's not really even advanced democracies versus less advanced democracies. You could see populisms arising in places that you wouldn't even call democracies, right? And the question really is, why is that the case? Now, I have my own sort of understanding of that, and my sense is that while populism actually has a very, very old and long sort of tradition, populism in the world today are all a reaction to the dislocations of neoliberal globalization. So, neoliberal globalization brings a lot of things that are good, prosperity and, more efficiency, more economic development and so on. But look at all the major economies of the world today, almost none of them have not experienced rapid growth in inequalities. That is the case certainly in the United States. I forget what the data is, but I think something like 1% of the population have, what is it now, 70% of the wealth, something like that. In Indonesia, the World Bank has stated that 1% of the population controls 50% of the wealth, right? That's not reflected in our Gini ratio, which is still only about 40, right? But the Gini ratio has really, impediments in really catching, the top 1% or the top half of 1%. And this is really where what we must be talking about. Because when we talk about the 1% in Indonesia, we're talking about 2.6 million people, right? And this is an economic bloc with power and purchasing power as well that can drive a lot of the things that we see today, the malls and all of these glitz, hotels and so on, whilst other people whose economic well-being may have improved over time lag behind the improvements that the 1% have experienced. And with some minor exceptions, such as Turkey, which experienced a very sort of minimal decline in its Gini ratio, Brazil under Lula, this is the case all over the world. In Australia, which has a a very strong social, democratic, egalitarian ethos, we see now that these things are also being pushed back. That the welfare state in Australia, such as in Europe, has also been in decline for many decades. And the result is that public services, welfare provisions and all that, things that generations of people used to take for granted after World War II, basically, are no longer available to new generations of people, whilst there has been a greater concentration of wealth. It has been said that only 2 Australians own more wealth than 20% of the rest of the country. And this is a social, democratic, egalitarian, country. Okay, imagine those that don't have that tradition. Okay? So, I think that all kinds of populisms, first of all, are reactions to the new marginalizations and dislocations of neoliberal globalization. And that is what distinguishes today's populisms in all of their varieties from, let's say, 1890s populisms, where you had the agrarian movement in the United States, you had the Narodniks in Russia, and various expressions of populisms in other parts of the world. This is special in that whilst all kinds of populisms are reactions to the same global processes that are occurring, the manifestations of those responses will be different, because it depends on what actually exists, right, in these countries that are integrated with these global processes of neoliberal capitalism. So, for example, in countries where there are strong traditions of the welfare state and social egalitarianism, perhaps there would be more resistance, right? Not necessarily effective resistance, but more resistance. In countries like America, where those traditions are much weaker historically than in Western Europe, with the defeat of, sort of the more militant streams of the labor movement in the 1910s and the 1920s, it's hardly surprising that the rollback, has been much more extensive and much more successful in the United States. In countries like Indonesia, where the state had never had the capacity to provide, welfare provisions extensively in spite of what it says in the Constitution, you can imagine what the effects of this can be, right? So the first thing is that, the first proposition is that the rise of populisms everywhere in the world today are representations of specific responses to the same processes of neoliberal globalization and the social dislocations and marginalizations that it produces. That's the first thesis. But before we go on to the implications and ramifications of populism, I should have to go to a second thesis, and that has to do with what is populism, right? Because this is actually a subject matter which in the literature on populism is highly contentious. People don't agree on how to define populism, okay? Now, I'd like to just maybe, have a bit of an interlude here where, let me just ask you, maybe just one or two people, just a quick answer. If I asked you, what is populism? What would be your answer? May I ask Pak Agus, what is populism to you?
Well, I think it's...
Microphone.
I think it is reactions to the, dissatisfaction usually to the elites, to the governments, and because of many reasons. So you will have, few people who thought that masses can be used to reach their, objective, political goals.
Okay, so
but the main aim is, struggle against the power.
Okay, so it's a mass movement against the existing power because of grievances. Okay, all right. Can I ask Bob? What would you say populism is, Bob?
It's a politics of certain elite figures premised on the idea of a corrupt, immoral, inauthentic elite controlling the system.
That's right.
And oppressing a virtuous
majority. Exactly. Okay. All right. So, in fact, the elements of what was stated just now are in most descriptions of populism. So we can describe populism. Populism, basically, in its most simple form, which is accepted, I think, in all the definitions, right, is a form of politics where, because of, accumulation of grievances, right, politics is understood as a conflict between a majority of people, right, who are usually virtuous and good and hardworking and all that, right, versus a minority, the power holders, as you pointed out there, who are rapacious, right, predatory, right, immoral, and often also regarded as being culturally aloof. Hence the references in America to Wall Street and Hollywood elites, right? East Coast, West Coast elites who don't know Middle America, right? And in Turkey, there's talk about the White Turks in Istanbul. So elite families in Istanbul who don't know about the life of virtuous religious people in the provinces. Okay, so it's this sort of thing. So it's an understanding of politics as a conflict between the virtuous majority and the sort of immoral, evil minority. However, these are to be defined. But of course, right, in their actual manifestations, specific manifestations, it is important to understand how understandings of that majority who are virtuous and the minority who are not are defined. Because these don't just fall in the air, but it's a process of, creating meaning through what, from my point of view, political contestations. Okay? So a process of political contestation then creates meanings which then define who belongs to this virtuous majority, who belongs to these evil elites that we must fight against. Right? Now, everybody agrees with that. But there are different approaches to populism. Right, and I'm not going to give a theoretical lecture on populism, but let me just go through them, a few of them, very quickly, just to tell you why I'm saying that people don't agree on how to approach it. One very, I think very easy to adhere to approach is what I call the ideational approach. And what this does really, it basically collects the ideas, right, of leaders usually, of populist movements, right, and the summary of these ideas really define what a populist agenda is meant to be, right? So it's the ideas, especially the ideas of the leaders of populist movements, okay? So there's a lot, what did Erdogan say, If anybody understands it, what does Trump think? Right? Okay? But there's another one. I don't really, although I think there are lots that are useful about that approach, the problem with that approach, I think, is that you get to you just basically get a list of ideas. Where do the ideas come from? We don't really get it. Another approach is what I might call the organizational approach. And this is where populism is basically defined as movements, as you said, mass movements even, whereby the institutions of representative democracy are bypassed in order to create more direct democracies, where the will of the people, right, has a greater and more direct connection to the policies of the leaders. And the idea here is that, you know, especially the institutions of representative democracy has created impediments to that, right? So political parties, parliaments, and all that, all bad. So we must have people's movements that bypass them, okay? And that is an element of populist politics, okay? But even though I like that definition again, I wonder, well, what are the social bases of these movements? And where do they come from? Okay? Another one, which is very famous, especially amongst the Syriza in Greece, Podemos in Spain, and a lot of the pink-tide people in Latin America, can be traced to the thinking of Ernesto Laclau. It's very complicated. I'm not going to try to, you probably are aware of it since you read Chantal Mouffe. The idea, this is the approach that I call the discursive approach, whereby the idea basically is to create signifiers, right? And this could be Pancasila. This could be Sharia. This could be the American dream, right? Whereby people of very diverse social backgrounds can actually find equivalency. So they find commonality in this empty signifier, right? So it's a politics whereby equivalence is created out of difference. The problem with Laclau for me is that the entire project is discursive. In fact, he eschews historical analysis. That has been his development from the 70s to the 2000s. The more he's gone through, if you study Laclau, the more he, you know, from the 70s to the 2000s, the less historical he became, okay? And for me, that is a real impediment to understanding how populist coalitions actually develop and evolve. So I have a different kind of approach, which of course I've also borrowed from a range of other scholars, but, you know, sort of mixed in and, you know, mixed up to develop something a bit different, is this. Whilst I do not disagree, you know, with the concerns of all the previous approaches I mentioned, especially the Laclauian actually, what I do is I turn Laclau on his head, in the same way that Marx turned Hegel on his head. Because I want to provide a material base to the discursive battles that Laclau imagines to happen. And in order to do this, one does have to adopt an historical and political, sociological and political economy approach, which is what I've tried to do. So for me, right, and keep in mind, very few people agree with me on this. Populisms are, in their essence, as expressions of asymmetrical multi-class alliances. They are asymmetrical in that elements in these alliances will always be more dominant than others. Okay? So the first thing is that, yes, populism brings together people of diverse social backgrounds and so on, right? But because their sociological origins and therefore their interests are actually very different from one another, populist coalitions are in their very nature fragile, tenuous, and internally contradictory. And that's why they're always very messy. The coalitions that make up populist coalitions, the elements that make up populist coalitions are easily shifting. And that is one of the reasons why, to keep them together, it is necessary to always have conflict. It is always necessary to have that other, the minority, the elites, whatever, to direct, the anger, the frustrations, grievances of the majority to keep them together. Okay, so that's the second thesis. Populisms are expressions of asymmetrical multi-class alliances. Third thesis regards what I call now, at least, the mechanics of populism. And the essential part of the mechanics of populism, all kinds of populisms, is this, is that it suspends difference. And that's very important in modern society, because modern society is actually sociologically very diverse. And that equivalence that Laclau was talking about is actually very difficult to create, much less to maintain over long periods of time. Right? So that difference needs to be suspended. How is it suspended? Well, one, again, is to maintain conflictual relationships. But a second thing is this. You make use of what I call culturally available, what I call to be historically available cultural resource pools. So, for example, you can develop, what might be called Islamic populism in Muslim majority countries, in the Middle East, in Indonesia. But it's, Islamic populism ain't going to be particularly effective in Brazil, because it doesn't resonate. The symbolisms and imagery and narratives of Islam do not resonate, right? In America, you have particular kinds of cultural pools. Sort of cultural symbolisms and references that come out of American history that, can resonate with a broad cross-section of society. And if it's harnessed, and appropriated by populist movements in a particular way, then it may be able to suspend difference so that your middle-class yuppie, who's angry that he's not advancing socially as much as he should be, he still doesn't have that loft in Greenwich Village, right, may be able to actually think that, the workers in the Rust Belt, who are also annoyed at different things, are right in supporting candidates that want a complete or say that they want a complete upheaval of the existing situation, right? So people of very diverse sorts of, sociological origins, right? Now, in Indonesia, I think the cultural resource pools that are the most effective for the development of populisms are nationalism and Islam. Okay? Now, so let me talk about the fourth thesis, which is that in Indonesia, as I said, because of what historically is made available in terms of cultural resource pools, it is most likely to develop nationalist and Islamic variations of populism. How do they differ? Okay, nationalist variations of populism in Indonesia are actually much closer to sort of conventional populisms or classical forms of populisms that have been identified as having coming out of Latin America in the 40s and the 1950s. In that, the key word, the key term, right, is the people, rakyat. And the rakyat, of course, as you know, includes you, and the guy who sells bakso. But somehow, all of you have to feel that you're part of one project. How is that achieved? Okay? Well, first of all, it has to make use of grievances that you and the tukang bakso might have in common. You might have grievances about, sort of more abstract kinds of social injustices, corruption and so on, right? The tukang bakso is aggrieved because, well, look at it, I can't go into these malls, and I pass them all the time. Middle-class students, right, who have gone through, decades of internalizing and consuming the promises of modernity, which is you work hard, you study hard, and you will move up the ladder of social mobility, may find that in the real world, actually, I'm stuck in precarious employment, even though I have a degree. That my social conditions are not that different from people who don't have a social degree, a university degree. I found the same thing in places like Cairo and Istanbul, where graduates of even engineering schools and so on are living in places that in Istanbul and especially downtown Cairo that isn't really all that different in conditions from that of the urban poor. Right. So, so they can actually, if not empathize, actually, connect with the grievances of the urban poor. So what I'm saying is that all of these grievances have to do with the, tendency of neoliberal globalization to create greater social inequalities in a range of societies, right? And that has to be made sense of. And responses to that have to be forged, right? And you need a lexicon of politics that will enable you to do that. Nationalist populisms do that by talking about the nation and all the symbolisms and the narratives that have to do with the nation, the fight against the Dutch, all the greatness of Majapahit and Sriwijaya, how Pancasila was dug up by our ancestors and all this stuff. Okay? And they take on a sort of sanctity. Islamic populism takes its cultural resources from a different sort of historical pool. The self-narratives that have developed in the Muslim world since late colonialism in particular, globally. And And from the Ottoman Empire, through South Asia to Southeast Asia, that narrative is that of marginalization within the Western-dominated colonial and neo-imperialist world. Right? It's important, for example, that in Indonesia, Islamic organizations and so on played a big part in the nationalist revolution, but were unable to dictate the terms, largely, of the nationalist state that would emerge. So again, the self-narrative is that we were marginalized under colonialism, we were marginalized under early post-colonialism. They wouldn't put in that Piagam Jakarta, right? Under Suharto, we were marginalized again because the Chinese conglomerates took over. Under Reformasi, with all this democracy, it seems like it's still the same Chinese conglomerates that's running things, and the same powerful oligarchic families. And remember, whilst historically Islamic populism had as its social base, small entrepreneurs, petty traders, and so on, the kind that Rian was talking about in Palembang yesterday, that self-narrative that had originated from them has now become generalized. And that has to do with the fact that, since the 70s and 80s and 90s, and this is something else to talk about, there has been a sort of growing Islamization, throughout the Muslim world, so that, for example, university students and so on, became more pious. Islamic organizations tended to dominate university life and so on. And this is actually not unique to Indonesia. When I was in Egypt after the revolution, it was stated that most of the professional organizations and the student organizations were controlled by the Muslim Brotherhood. Of course, not anymore, because the military's clamped down the Muslim Brotherhood, right? But you have that process by which, for example, young people who have graduated from universities with skills, knowledge, and so on, find that they go into the world and they can't move up because the world is actually corrupt and immoral, right? So, in both of these versions, they find who is, the people, that majority, and who is the minority. In the nationalist version, it's the people. And that minority are usually the lackeys of foreign powers, right? But also that can then develop into things like broader things, like, well, this is what it means to be considered to be part of the Indonesian nation, which is good. Then you have to be Pancasila. Pancasila means particular cultural values. If you don't adhere to those cultural values, you are un-Pancasila and therefore un-Indonesian. So what you get is a new kind of politics of exclusion and inclusion. In Islamic populism, the idea of the people, which is the basic idea of all conventional populisms, is replaced by the idea of the umat. The umat is effectively the substitute of the people. And they are also considered to be, or portrayed to be, the majority, suffering throughout history, virtuous, moral, right, against an elite that are necessarily, of course, logically defined as those outside of the ummah. These can be secular people, these can be Chinese, and these can be the foreign, connections of these sorts of people. Okay, so in both cases, actually, there's a politics of inclusion and exclusion that's developed. In spite of the fact that, ironically or paradoxically, populism is about trying to bring together as much as possible, a broad range of society into a political project. Okay? Okay, am I being clear here?
Hopefully.
Am I being clear here?
Yeah.
So, yeah, okay. All right. Fifth thesis, the political agendas of populisms are not predetermined. It depends partly on the specific constellation of power that exists. It depends on in how strong these sort of cultural resource pools can be mobilized, the existence of organizing capacities to harness and mobilize these sorts of symbols, but also the social bases of these populisms may be different. So, for example, if you have populisms that are mainly led by aggrieved sections of the bourgeoisie, and that's possible, who feel that even though they're wealthy, right, they aren't really getting control over the economy in the way that they should. That, I think, is the case, for example, in Turkey, where you have a culturally Islamic bourgeoisie coming out of the provinces who are at the vanguard of an Islamic populist movement whose major aim, for me, really, is to not overthrow the Kemalist establishment, so to speak, but to replace it with their own social agents in the key positions. So basically, to take control over the institutions of the state and to win power over the economic realm. From that point of view, it is not surprising that the AKP in Turkey, right, does not talk about an Islamic state. Of course, constitutionally, it's difficult for it to do it, but when you talk about it, it's like in the back of their minds. It's not necessary, really, to talk about an Islamic state when you can control the existing state and win control over the business world. They've done the first, they're trying to do the second. Okay? This kind of populism, you can expect, will be what you might sort of call right-wing. Right. Populisms that have a social base in sort of labor movements or the sort of marginalized and so on, although there will always be an alliance with sections of the middle class and so on, like Syriza in Greece, for example, right, may then take an agenda that we could sort of roughly call leftist. Right. Also because there are cultural resonances, that still exist in Greece that make leftist symbolisms, appealing to those who feel aggrieved by current circumstances. But in Indonesia, of course, resort to or appealing to leftist imageries of politics, leftist lexicon, is impossible because of 1965 and what's happened afterwards. So, in other words, dissent can only be articulated in nationalist and Islamic terms. Okay? And to add to that, I would say that Indonesia has always had a very weak and very undeveloped liberal and social democratic social base. Okay? Okay, final thesis, which has to do with populism and oligarchy. Like most populisms, I don't think the varieties of populisms that exist in Indonesia actually want to overthrow the existing social order. What the agenda is actually to get in to the existing social order. Okay? So from this point of view, both nationalist and Islamic populisms, for me, have been absorbed into, appropriated, and harnessed by oligarchic intra-competition. It's not an alternative. It's very much part of the mainstream. In fact, you might say that throughout the world, and this is where comparative things are interesting, the result of the emergence of populisms is that ideas that used to be in the fringe have become mainstreamed as they are harnessed in competitions between elites. That's what's happened, I think, in America. That's what's happened in Australia. When I first arrived in Australia, about 25 years ago, I've been back and forth since then, the things that I hear being talked about in the press, on television, mainstream press, by political parties and so on, could not have been stated in 1992, 1993. Full of racism, at least implied, and anti-immigration and these sort of, things. It would have been almost impossible. But what happened was that the Liberal Party of Australia then just brought in the ideas of a party called One Nation, which was very, very conservative and very, very xenophobic, and mainstreamed those ideas. I think that is what's happening in Indonesia today as well. So the ideas of the FPI, which used to be fringe, are now mainstream. Which I find quite amazing, As populism becomes increasingly harnessed, appropriated, and absorbed by intra-oligarchic competition. Okay? And there are some, I think, insofar as Islamic populism is concerned, there are some, I think, results which maybe Bob would be concerned with. And it's this. I think that the major Islamic organizations, the Nahdlatul Ulama and the Muhammadiyah, are increasingly feeling, and rightly so, that they are being left by parts of their constituency, left behind. Why? Because parts of these constituencies, which include young people, remember Indonesia is a very young country, who are angry and frustrated and so on by all these conditions I talked about earlier, find more appeal in the heroic, bombastic talk of the FPI and Hizb ut-Tahrir and all these other organizations. And who goes, oh, sabar, sabar, that's not interesting. And the result of it is that large sections of the leadership of these organizations now realize that they have to move in that direction in order to maintain their constituency. And people like Ma'ruf Amin becomes increasingly important within NU rather than, the Abdul Rahman Wahid types. Also, even in Muhammadiyah, I talked to, somebody who leads the youth wing of the Muhammadiyah. He goes, yeah, it's terrible. We tell them not to go, but then again, the leaders of Muhammadiyah go anyway, so mixed signals there, right? I'm talking about the riots, the Ahok riots, and yet they go. What does that mean? Well, it means that they're not listening to us, and if we don't find a way of actually resonating with them again, therefore speaking their language, we might become irrelevant. And therefore, right, the implications of the marriage between populism and oligarchy is increasing illiberalism in Indonesian democracy, increasing conservatism, not just from the Islamic side. The response to this Islamic populism has been what I call hyper-nationalism. And basically this has been about promoting a lot of ideas that, frankly, with all due respect to people in the faculty who work on Pancasila, when I was an activist in the 1980s, I thought were instruments to suppress dissent. the idea of the harmonious relationship between state and society, that, you know, that there's a common culture, and these were all instruments in the order to suppress dissent and the student movement, who wanted democracy, and the democracy was called un-Indonesian. And now, you know, like the Islamic populism, things like, well, if you're for LGBT rights, well, that's culturally un-Indonesian. It's also un-Islamic. So the combination of this is the increasing conservativization of Indonesian democracy, the strengthening of its illiberal tendencies. But I would like to stress that it is not about competition between Islamic and nationalist populisms. It isn't actually, because there is no such thing as concrete historical blocks that represent these two. What you see is that, really, in the way that the they've been merged with the oligarchy, is that the oligarchy will, on the basis of very pragmatic, real politics kinds of considerations, especially in relation to elections and so on, will go back and forth between the symbolisms of Islam and nationalism. So Prabowo, when he talks to some group, will go, yeah, Islam, Islam, Islam. He goes to another group, he goes, you know, Pancasila, Pancasila, Pancasila. Jokowi too. He goes to the NU, he goes, Nadia, Islam, yeah, Islam, kontribusi Islam and all that. He goes to GMNI, other groups. It's Perjuangan Nasional, Pancasila, etc. You know. So it's not really Islamic populism versus nationalist populisms in terms of, you know, sort of concrete historical blocks. These are just, yeah, sort of cultural reference tools which resonate, right, with large populations of the people, that can be harnessed by particular kinds of social political agents. And these are the social and political agents that are the most powerful. So they are now defining, you know, the use of populism in Indonesia, right? And I suppose if I were to talk about the final implication of this, is that we, because of the particular history that, you know, that we've had over the last 50, 60, 70 years, there is yet to be developed anything that can challenge these tendencies that I've talked to you about. There is no social base for liberalism. There is no social base for social democracy. People who are liberal or social democratic or whatever will then drift towards one of these camps, as you see now. People who, you know, you see, you know, have this real liberal persona or whatever on TV, you know, they're saying, oh, now they're talking to the FPI. People who in the 80s were going, well, Pancasila was a tool of the authoritarian state, are talking about Pancasila like P4 used to be given in the 1980s. So that's all I have right now. Thank you very much.